Taste the rainbow, 1987 ends on a high note with NES Works episode 70. Here we are at the end of NES Works 1987. It's been a heck of a year, nearly tripling the NES's library and establishing third parties as the primary motive force for the platform's future. At this point, the NES library contains almost 90 games from more than a dozen publishers and even more developers. At this point, the entire platform is healthy enough that the black box games have begun to feel like pleasant relics of a bygone era rather than the bold glimpses of the future they represented at the console's test launch 2 years ago. The NES now has some very, very good games, and also some very, very bad games. And then there's Mega Man, a very, very good game dressed up as a very, very bad game. Many jokes have been made about just how ugly the box art for the original Mega Man was, and yes, haha, it's all very funny. But it's honestly difficult to express just how much of a disservice this packaging did to a game that deserved far better presentation. From the clumsy painting to the incredibly goofy name Mega Man, nothing about this box art speaks to the excellent content contained within, to say nothing of the legacy it would spawn. Even the screenshots on the back undersell the game, just a shot of the level select screen, which is just a handful of tiny sprites on a solid blue background. Anecdotally speaking, I saw Mega Man many times at the store back when it was new and never once considered picking it up. It wasn't until I saw stunning screenshots of the sequel in Nintendo Power that I reconsidered, and at that point, a year and a half after Mega Man's debut, it had been clearanced like all the rest of the unwanted, discontinued duds on NES. But Mega Man was anything but a dud. Sure, this original game has some issues, and it pales in comparison to its incredible sequels. But if you look at this game in the context of the state of the NES in 1987, compare it to the past 69 videos, you can't help but be impressed by what Capcom accomplished here with this, the company's first wholly original creation for NES. Up until this point, half of Capcom's games had been outsourced, and quite poorly at that, and all of them had been adaptations of original arcade games. Commando, Trojan, and especially Section Z demonstrated a lot of imagination and ambition by Capcom's newly minted console development department, but none of them broke any particular creative boundaries, not the way Mega Man did. Mega Man comes to us from two driving creative minds, Tokuro Fujiwara, better known as the guy behind most of Capcom's arcade hits, including Ghosts and Goblins, and Akira Kitamura, a fresh face in development. The two couldn't have been more different in terms of their philosophical approaches to game design. Fujiwara was about bone-crushing difficulty and coin-crunching, merciless adversity. Kitamura, on the other hand, was about the flow and experience of a game. He believed in encouraging players, even as he challenged them. While Fujiwara's input is likely responsible for the fact that Mega Man is one of the best playing games yet to appear on NES, with crisp controls and highly focused but flexible mechanics, we can probably credit Kitamura for making Mega Man fun. It was his perspective that gives each stage of the game a sort of amplified loop, with peaks and troughs of challenge that rise and fall before culminating in a showdown with a boss. Both of these strengths play off each other, collectively turning Mega Man into far more than just another NES game. It's a platform action game, which we've already seen plenty of, and it has lots of shooting, of which there's no shortage on NES. However, it's in the combination of these elements that Mega Man shines, not to mention all the other things it does with them. Mega Man brilliantly walks a line directly between straightforward, linear action platformers like Super Mario Bros. Or Castlevania, and non-linear exploratory platformers like Metroid and Rygar. It consists of 10 stages, each of which is a direct jaunt to the end where a boss awaits. But aside from the final boss gauntlet, you don't have to complete these stages in any particular order. You begin the game with that plain-looking level select screen, where you preview each of the 6 main bosses that need to be defeated and choose which you'd like to go after first. Some bosses are definitely easier than others at the outset. Taking on a Lek-Man or Iceman directly out of the gate is a profoundly foolish choice, whereas Bomb Man and Cut Man are fairly manageable starting points. There are hundreds of different sequences in which you can potentially tackle the game, though as you play, or read a strategy guide, you'll gradually come to realize that there are only a handful of optimal routes. Which isn't to say you need to stick to the same order every time, especially once you master the game and seek a fresh challenge. But Mega Man's a pretty tough game, so it's not a bad idea to tackle the stages in a recommended order to minimize the pain. See, there's a point to beating the bosses besides getting to the next stage. Each boss has a unique power, hinted at by its name. Fireman blasts waves of fire. Iceman fires off arrows of ice. Gutsman can heave stone blocks, and so forth. Mega Man's power is the ability to steal these other powers from the bosses. Once you defeat a level, you add its boss's power to your arsenal. You can switch between all your available weapons at any time by opening the menu screen and selecting the proper icon. Each alternate weapon has its own limited ammunition supply, which can be refilled by collecting power-up icons along the way, or by dying and choosing to continue. And most importantly, each alternate weapon is especially effective against one or more of the bosses. These weaknesses are also hinted at by the characters' names. In Japan, Mega Man is called Rockman. That's as in rock, paper, scissors. And just as in RPS, the right weapon at the right time is the key to victory. There's no Paperman here, and Rockman, or Mega Man himself, doesn't have any innate special powers, but you can see a little hint of the game's inspiration in the chain of boss weaknesses. Cutman, who flings a bladed boomerang, is vulnerable to Gutsman's power, which allows Mega Man to throw rocks. Because, as we all know, rock beats scissors. These aren't temporary or fragile power-ups as in Super Mario Bros. Or Athena. Mega Man keeps every weapon he collects through the end of this adventure, and he can use them whenever he likes, provided he keeps their energy topped up. This creates a fantastic gameplay loop where you're rewarded for defeating each stage with a tangible reward that in turn makes the game more fun to play. Each weapon is completely different from the rest, too. Cutman's Rolling Cutter is a rapid-fire boomerang that flies in a compressed arc that allows it to hit enemies that might otherwise be outside the range of your fire. Elecman's Thunderbeam fires off in 3 directions at once, allowing you to hit enemies directly above and below Mega Man. Not all weapons are created equally, of course. The fuse timer on Bomb Man's Hyper Bomb means it takes way too long to detonate to be useful, and Gutsman's Super Arm is completely useless unless there's a specific kind of stone block nearby. Even so, the spirit of the thing is appreciated, and each weapon is deliberately designed not only to deliver extra damage to a specific foe, but to counter their combat behavior as well. A lot of thought went into Mega Man's design, and while it's hardly the best balanced game ever, the amount of flexibility and freedom Capcom crammed into a game that can be completed in its entirety in 1 hour is honestly impressive. On top of that, Mega Man looks and sounds great too. Its visuals are a bit on the plain side, as Capcom went with a UN ROM chip for the game rather than a cutting-edge MMC1 like in The Legend of Zelda or Metroid, so there's not a whole lot of room for visual data here. The graphic designers turned the flat, limited visuals into a strength, giving the characters that inhabit Mega Man's world a lively cartoon style. Mega Man and all of his foes are robots, but they're not the hard-edged metal deathbots of American sci-fi. The visuals draw on anime here, specifically Astro Boy, and even the most nondescript robot has charm and personality. Bad guys have big bulging eyeballs, rounded edges, and whimsical animation cycles. Consider the Crazy Razies in Iceman's stage. They're taller than Mega Man, so if you shoot them straight ahead, you'll destroy their legs and cause their upper torsos to sprout a propeller and attack independently. Or consider the series' eventual mascot, the Metal, which is basically just a Japanese-style construction hard hat that occasionally pops up its front edge to reveal a pair of eyeballs that fire off a trio of bullets. Metals are 1 part Dragon Quest slime, 1 part Star Wars Jawa, and 1 part familiar real-world analog. After all, the robots here were designed as day-to-day assistants. There's a story in Mega Man's stage design if you look for it. For example, in Iceman's level, he's taken over a tropical resort, so even though his stage is encrusted by snow and ice and patrolled by penguin bots, you'll spot frozen palm trees in the background. Meanwhile, Bomb Man appears to be a straight-up terrorist, a dude slinging bombs and seemingly holding a futuristic city for ransom. Of course, the robots themselves aren't the real culprits here. They've all been programmed for evil by the mad scientist Dr. Albert Wily, a former assistant to Mega Man's creator, Dr. Thomas Light. After you take down the 6 robot masters and swipe their weapons, you venture ahead to Wily's lair. This too has a sort of narrative flow as you warp outside of Wily's fortress, rip the walls open with your bare hands, climb to a bridge that takes you to Wily's inner fortress, and ascend until you finally reach the villain's lair, where he's begun mass manufacture of the robot masters for world conquest. Wily's lair consists of 4 stages that have to be tackled in order, and you also need 1 other item besides the 6 robot master weapons. Hidden behind a wall in Elecman's stage is a tool called the Magnet Beam, which you need in order to climb your way to the bridge in the fortress. Without it, you can't progress beyond Wily Stage 1 and have to backtrack through the world to find the Magnet Beam. Chances are you won't be able to collect the Magnet Beam your first time through the stage, since it can only be accessed either with Gutsman's power or with Elecman's. The latter you obviously can't use until you've beaten Elecman, while the former is acquired at the end of a stage that begins with some ruthless platforming that is far more easily completed once you have the Magnet Beam. and this I think gets at some of the flaws inherent in Mega Man. It can be a mean-spirited game at times, as you'd expect from something produced by Tokuro Fujiwara. The damage-moving platforms and Gutsman stage are fast-moving and equally quick to spill you into a pit before you can blink. Worse, there's a vast chasm that can only be cleared by riding floating platforms. Unfortunately, these platforms like to shoot at you, and worse, the fussy collision detection on their upper surface means you'll sometimes fall through what should be a safe foothold to your death, even if you play well. Those things come after the series' first appearance of the much-hated bane of all Mega Man players, the Vanishing Block Gauntlet. Tiny platforms that appear and disappear in a pattern that must be mastered in order to move ahead to the next area. And then there's the infamous boss of the first Wily stage, the Yellow Devil. While it's possible, at least in the original NES release, to cheese the boss by firing the Thunder Beam and rapidly tapping pause to cause the beam to register a fresh hit each time, you're meant to beat the Yellow Devil by memorizing the pattern in which his blocks fly across the screen and dodging them over and over, in order to fire off a single shot at the boss during the 2-second window in which its eye is vulnerable, during which window he's firing a counterattack directly at Mega Man. And finally, once you reach Wily's Inner Sanctum, a tricky level is capped by a repeat encounter with resurrected Robot Masters, followed by a 2-phase battle against Wily's personal war machine, each phase of which can only be damaged by using a specific weapon against it. This is not an easy game. Mega Man does give you infinite continues though, even if there are no password saves and no health-topping energy tanks to collect. But most of all, it's a game you don't mind challenging because it plays so well. Mega Man himself moves exactly the way you want him to. Yeah, this first game has a little too much knockback when you take damage, and there's a completely vestigial and pointless scoring system that would be abandoned in future sequels. Moving platforms can be glitchy, and sometimes weapons act a little funky. But consider how much Mega Man attempts and succeeds compared to other third-party games of 1987. This is a game that belongs in a rare class for releases of this vintage, right up there with Castlevania and maybe the Goonies too. It's a new imaginative property from an up-and-coming developer. And aside from a few little quirks that would be ironed out in the sequels, it pulls off just about everything it attempts to accomplish. Consider which 1987 games and characters have been enshrined in the definitive Nintendo pantheon that is a playable character in Super Smash Bros. Pit from Kid Icarus, Samus and Ridley from Metroid, Little Mac from Punch-Out, Link, Zelda, and Ganon from The Legend of Zelda. All Nintendo characters. From the third-party side, there are only two, Simon Belmont from Castlevania and Mega Man. Mega Man wouldn't truly become great until the second game, which we'll see in NES Works 1989. But the elements are all here for a classic franchise that would build on the components of a badly marketed and fairly obscure NES release. Great controls, extensive freedom, fun alternate weapons, charming visuals, memorable bosses, tough but fair gameplay, a cycling spectrum of colors as the hero swaps his weapons around. And always some sort of goofy, paper-thin villain cackling away behind his schemes. While it's true Capcom hasn't always really understood how best to treat Mega Man, and his history of late has been more off than on, this series would go on to become one of the basic pillars of the NES. And this is the beginning of an absolutely astounding run from Capcom, who with this one game finally struck the creative gold they'd been prospecting for since Trojan, way back at the very beginning of 1987. NES Works 1987 has brought us many stories. Nintendo figuring out how to replicate the features of the Famicom Disk System and standard carts to bring us Metroid and Zelda. Konami building on the promise of Gradius with some genuine classics. New third parties like Tecmo and Taito bringing their arcade prowess to bear on NES while not being hesitant to revamp their creations to work better at home. New peripherals. All-time collector's rarities. Failed attempts to uphold great legacies. And finally here, Capcom truly defining itself as a key force in NES gaming after a rocky start in 1986. When NES Works returns in 2021, we'll see games from both Capcom and other studios that build on the great things 1987 brought us. We'll also see an increase in the volume of disappointing trash, too. They can't all be winners after all. The NES ended 1987 strong, and at this point in its life cycle, this was the coolest toy in America. The gift every kid wanted for birthdays or the holidays. And after all we've seen over the past 35 episodes, it's not hard to understand why. The NES has single-handedly taken console gaming in the US from dying on life support to the beginning of a new golden era. And here in America, it would be another 2 years before anyone managed to challenge the console's dominance. So, see you next year. For now, we're going from Nintendo's time of ascendance to its dark downfall as the focus shifts over to N64 Works.